So when we do core 8, it is actually backwards. we don't go from questions. In fact, we won't touch these questions until we're done presenting everything for photosynthesis. And there's a reason why. The core 8 questions are loaded with vocabulary. I mean, just it is a crazy amount of vocabulary. So if you jump into the questions too early, you have no background, and they're talking about NADP and different electron carriers, and they're talking about photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, and like I don't know what you're talking about. So this is a discussion first, right? And then we'll go to the diagrams, and then we'll go back to these questions. Okay, so actually we hit these questions at the end, and I need to give you background. And this is biochemistry, where it's all a matter of having it reviewed and having it discussed. There's nothing in here that you can't handle. There's information that's new that you've never heard of. That doesn't make it difficult. It's just like replication, where if we sit down and we say, all right, we're going to talk about DNA, well, we're going to talk about RNA primase, polymerase 3, DNA polymerase 1, DNA ligase, helicase, and gyrase, right? Had I brought out all 6 enzymes at the same time, right, you just go, I don't know what you're talking about. So how do you do that? You do it in pieces, and you build up the understanding. This is exactly the same way. Biochemistry is not difficult when it's presented methodically and in pieces. People get overwhelmed with biochemistry when there's no scaffolding, there's no structure to the discussion. So you can totally handle this. I just need about 3 days of your time, no sweat. Okay, so photosynthesis is all, well, and cell resp too, is all about electrons. It's all biochemistry when it comes to cells is about electrons, right? That's why if you were in my freshman class, that's why right out of the gate when I first taught you photosynthesis and cell resp, what do we talk about? Low energy and high energy electrons, low energy and high energy. That's what it's all about. So when you get into photosynthesis, you have to talk about electrons first. Okay, so let's put a box around it. And then we'll talk about how the electrons get excited, it carries them, and where do they go, and it's a production. So chemists talk about reactions that deal with electrons. They call them redox reactions. Okay, and why do they call them redox? Because they're oxidation and reduction reactions. Now, here I find fascinating. When chemists talk about reactions that with electrons, they always say oxidation, reduction, oxidation, reduction. And to me, that sets the students up, okay? Because then when they summarize these, what do they call them? Redox, right? They don't call it red, they call them redox. And so just right out of the gate, we start reversing things on you. And that just means spirited, okay? We don't do it on purpose. It's, you know, it's the chemists. It's never the biologist's fault. It's always those chemists. So when you're talking about electrons being involved in a chemical reaction, the oxidation always comes first. Oxidation always comes first. And reduction always comes second. Always. So even us calling these redox reactions, we should actually call them ox-red reactions, because oxidation always happens first and reduction always happens second. So what is this all about? It's very, very simple. A redox reaction is simply about the movement of electrons. That's all it is. Simply all it is. Okay, so if you have a molecule, let's say that you have, oh, let's just say a substrate. Let's say substrate A. And over here you have substrate B. And there's going to be electron transfer between these two substrates, okay? When this substrate loses the electron, that is called oxidation. Let me get my pen here. There we go. This is oxidation. And then this substrate is going to gain the electron. And by definition, we call this reduction. That's all there is to it. Okay? So if I have an electron, okay, and I give it to you, okay, therefore, since I am losing the electrons, I am substrate A, right? I am oxidized, right? And since you are receiving the electron, you are reduced. That's why oxidation has to happen first for reduction. You have to have an electron to accept in order to be reduced. So oxidation always comes first, and reduction always happens second, even though we call these redox reactions. Okay, it's just the movement of electrons is all it is. So how do you remember this? Well, you guys ever driven up the California coast and you see to me it always, as a kid, always looked like a dinosaur head going up and down. Have you ever seen these oil pumps? Or out in the ocean, you see what looks kind of like the Eiffel Tower. And yeah, these are the oil rig, right, for the offshore drilling. Okay, so if I talk about an oil rig, do you know what I'm talking about? It's the platform where they drill into the earth for petroleum.
Yep.
You comfortable with? Okay. So, I mean, if you don't know what an oil rig is, then this word association means nothing to you. Okay, so one of the ways that you can remember oxidation and reduction is oil rig, okay? Under the assumption that you know what an oil rig is. If you don't, you might want to Google it, especially because there's going to be a big discussion about oil rigs in California because the drilling off of California has increased over the last 4 years. And now those jobs are going to be reduced because the amount of drilling is going to be reduced. So the environmentalists are going to say that's good news, right? Because we are drilling for less petroleum, but people are going to be upset because they're going to lose their job. It's a really interesting discussion. All right, so oil rig. What does it mean? It means oxidation is the loss of electrons. Where the oil comes from. Oxidation is loss. Okay, so if I have that electron and I am losing it, therefore I am oxidized. Okay. However, from your perspective, as the electron comes towards you, right? So then reduction is the gain of electrons. So as I give the electron away, you accept the electron. Therefore, reduction is gain. Okay? But hold it. If you're gaining an electron, why do we call it reduction? You're gaining it.
Because the charge is lowering.
There you go, because of the charge. All right, that's fantastic. The charge of an electron is negative. As you take on more and more electrons, you're taking on more and more of a negative charge. As you take on more and more of a negative charge, your overall charge is decreasing. Your overall charge is reducing. Okay, so that's why we call the gain of electrons reduction. Cool. That's one way to remember it. I've also seen Leo goes grrr. This noise makes me, okay, so Leo making a reference to the astrological sign of Leo, right, which is the lion, right, and lions growl, thus the grrr, right? So what do you think the Leo stands for? Considering we're talking about L and G. L and G. The what?
Loss.
Loss. What do you think the E is? The loss of
Electrons.
electrons. The loss of electrons is
Oxidation.
oxidation. There you go. Awesome. So the loss of oxidation. Okay. What do you think GER is?
The gain of electrons is reduction.
There you go. The gain of electrons is reduction. Again, these are just acronyms to help you know the chemistry. Then I had a student a couple years ago come up with ELMO, which I thought was adorable. Okay. And they said electron loss means oxidation. And then they said, once I learned what oxidation was, then electron gain is reduction. Okay. So if any of these three work for you, great. If they don't work for you, then that's okay. Pick up your own. Okay. I should number these pages, by the way. But the most important thing to remember is oxidation and reduction is nothing more than the transfer of electrons from one substrate to another. That's it. Cool?
Yep.
May I take this? I'm going to take this. We'll do it. All right. So what does this have to do with the big picture? Because all too often when we go through this biochemistry, holy cow, people get lost. It's called get lost in the weeds. You get lost in all of the details. So I'm going to consistently pull you back and say, hey, big picture idea. What's the big picture here? Okay. Photosynthesis is important because photosynthesis excites electrons to make macromolecules. That's the purpose of photosynthesis. Excite electrons to make macromolecules. What does the rest of the world call macromolecules? Food. Okay, so food is food because it has energy in it. Well, then how do we get that energy out? That's cellular respiration. Okay, so photosynthesis puts the energy into the molecule, right? That's actually sunlight. We'll talk about that later, right? And then cellular respiration, process of getting the energy back out of that food. What makes plants so cool? Plants do both. Plants do both photosynthesis and cell resp, right? Whereas us animals, we just do cell resp. So we're going to have a reminder here that food is oxidized for the high energy electrons. Ultimately, that's why we eat. We eat to rip the high energy electrons out of macromolecules to make ATP. Plants, while they don't eat, they still manufacture food. That's why plants do photosynthesis. They're autotrophs. They're making their own food to eat, right? So then the plant takes a macromolecule and rips it apart through the same process we use of cellular respiration. It isn't similar, it's identical. Okay, so we need to make ourselves a cycle. Did I pull that all the way? I did not. So let's cycle this out. So let's put macromolecules over here. Macromolecules with their high energy electrons, let's put those here. And then ultimately, you will find out in about 3 weeks that there's this thing called the electron transport chain. But of course, in science, we never, or very rarely do we say the whole word. So electron transport chain immediately gets reduced down to the ETC. Okay. So the electrons that are here, the high energy electrons here, ultimately will be used over here. Okay. And that right there, that's a discussion in about 2 to 3 weeks. Okay. So plants take the food that they make, or we eat. Cool. And then what do we do, and what do all cells do to these macromolecules? They rip out the high energy electrons. Okay. Well, if you're ripping out high energy electrons, what process is that? As you rip out high energy electrons, what's happening to the macromolecules? They are being what?
Oxidized.
They're being oxidized. Okay. Therefore, this is oxidation. Okay. Well, why do you oxidize your food? Okay. To get the high energy electrons out. Well, then those high energy electrons go through the process of cellular respiration. And ultimately are delivered to a structure inside of the mitochondrion called the electron transport chain that we'll talk about later. Okay. Well, there's a lot of energy going into the electron transport chain, and all these high energy electrons. And that energy is used to bond together ADP and P, or adenosine diphosphate, and a phosphate to make what?
ATP.
ATP. That's our ultimate goal. The energy from the sun is put into molecules. We call those molecules macromolecules. And then those electrons are pulled out. Why? To make ATP. Plants make ATP, bacteria make ATP, fungus make ATP, we make ATP. Every cell does this process right here. However, since the energy went into the ATP, what kind of electrons do you think come out of the electron transport chain?
Low energy electrons.
Low energy electrons. Poor little low energy electrons. Okay? Those low energy electrons are bonded to protons to make hydrogen. And then what gas do all living things need, or they will die?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. Hold it. Plants need oxygen too? Yep. This whole concept that we breathe out CO2 for the plants and plants produce O2 for us is a fallacy, okay? While the oxygen and carbon does cycle back and forth, the purpose of plants is not to be an oxygen factory for us, okay? That is not accurate. Well, hold it. The oxygen then picks up the protons and the electrons and makes water. So hold it. The oxygen just picked up electrons. Therefore, what happened to the oxygen as it picked up the electrons? What happened right here?
Reduce charge.
Yep, reduce the charge by the process of
Reduction.
reduction. And then this is why water, and we talked about this back in Core 2, and we're bringing that right back up, water contains low energy electrons, which are then used in photosynthesis to make macromolecules. And thus the circle of life. People talk about, what's the circle of life? No, it's right there. It's the carbon cycle, and it's this. And where does the energy come from over here? Because we have energy output over there. What's the energy input down here?
The sun.
The sun. Maybe you've seen it. Right? So ultimately, ultimately, the energy from the sun is captured during photosynthesis. The energy from the sun is then stored in high energy electrons. That energy is then transferred to a molecule called ATP. So what used to be energy in the sun is now stored energy in ATP. The low energy electrons come back out and are recycled back into the water, and the process happens over and over, and just to numbers that, in all honesty, I can't fathom. The amount of numbers here of electrons and ATP and the number of cycles, my brain just melts because the numbers are just astronomical, huge. Okay, so this is the big picture that I want in your head, all right? Because we're going to spend about the next 10 days talking about this leg over here. And then we'll have presentations. We say, okay, comfortable with this leg? Okay, cool. And then we'll take a couple of weeks and we'll do this leg over here, because ultimately we're going to put these two together and go, do you get it? Okay. Energy in, energy out. Okay. Well, something has to carry that energy. Who carries the energy? The electrons. So ultimately, this whole cycle of energy depends on electrons. Electrons being given away, which is oxidation, and electrons being picked up, being reduction. So that's why oxidation here and reduction here are so important. If you're going to truly understand photosynthesis and cellular respiration, you have to understand oxidation and reduction. You have to understand the chemistry. To be good at biology, you have to be good at chemistry. Okay, and for those of you bio majors that are going to go off into the wild blue yonder, that is the university, right? You have to go through a couple terms, whether you're doing semesters or quarters, depends on the university, right? You need to go through a couple terms of inorganic chemistry, then a couple terms of organic chemistry, and then a couple terms of biochemistry. Why? That's the language. I almost said the English. That's the language of biology. It's chemistry. Okay. And if you're not going to be a bio, totally cool, then you're going to be a liberal arts major who understands a ton of science. What did Arnold say? I will never forget photosystem 2 in the Krebs cycle. It's awesome. All right, may I take this?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So let's return to core 2 and let's hit some content that if you had me as a freshman, you saw as a freshman, and then you saw again in core 2. And then, hey, guess what? It's part of the intro to core 8. So I'd leave yourself some space here, okay? And we're going to come down here and we're going to write CO2 plus, leave a space, H2O. The cofactors, what are required? Light and enzymes for the production of C6H12O6, and leave a space, O2. Hopefully that looks a little familiar, maybe, from back when you were young. Life was simple. So what do I need? I need purple, the yellow. If you have colors, it may be useful. If you don't have colors, that's okay. You can use my notes and take the color. Totally cool. All right, so let's talk about what happens to water. Plants absorb the water, right? Plants need water, fine. Let's talk about why. Plants absorb the water. Okay, the plants then, so that's step 1. Actually, I should label that. That's step 1. We'll put a 1 right there. Should probably put that in red too, so it jumps off the page. Boom. Plants absorb the water. Fine. Okay. Then plants use light. Plants actually end up using light twice. Plants use light to split that water. Do you happen to remember the name of the process that splits the water? Maybe?
Lysis?
Yes, lysis means split. Nice. And then since we're using light, the root for light is?
Photolysis.
Yes, photolysis. I even pronounced correctly. Nicely done. Okay, the stress for that word is in the middle on the table. Well, photolysis. Very nice. What this term literally means is the splitting using light. The splitting of what? The splitting of water. Okay, so that would be step 2. Light is used to split the water. Why? Because when plants absorb water, they're really after the electrons that are in that hydrogen. Nothing personal against the oxygen. It doesn't have any purpose right now. Okay, so the plant discards it. Now, you just got done with doing the Core 7 presentations where they talked about junk DNA, right? Okay, and how words imply the value of what you're talking about. So this oxygen here is released. Okay, now if I call that waste, by saying waste, that implies that that oxygen has no purpose. Oh my gosh, that oxygen has a huge purpose. It's going to go to cell resp and pick up the low energy electrons after the electron transport chain. Okay, this oxygen doesn't have a use right now. Okay, so we don't call it a waste, we call it a byproduct, because words elicit emotion. It's called they're being emotive. And if I call that waste, that implies that that oxygen is useless, and it's not. Boom. So step 1, plants absorb the water. Step 2, plants split the water by photolysis, right? After the plants split the water, the oxygen is released as a byproduct, which means we need to track this oxygen. So ultimately, when we say that plants release oxygen, where did that oxygen come from?
Water.
From the water, you bet. Right? So then here, plants actually absorb water for the hydrogen, okay? Because guess what's in the hydrogen?
Low energy electrons.
Low energy electrons, okay? So plants actually absorb water for the low energy electrons. That's why you water your plants. You water your plants to provide them with a low energy electron source. That's actually why you water your plants. But hydrogen is separated, the protons and the electrons, we'll talk about how that works in a couple of days, right? So the electrons are getting pulled out of the hydrogen. Whole electrons are leaving. What happens to the water? What am I going to label that arrow right there as the electrons are pulled out? What is that right there?
Oxidation.
Excellent, that's oxidation. Okay. All right, you have low energy electrons. Kind of useless right now. So what plant do to those low energy electrons?
Excite.
Excites how? How does the plant excite the electrons? Using
Light.
what? Light. So how many times do plants use light?
2.
Twice. Okay. The first time that the plants use light is to split the water. And the second time that plants use light is to excite the electrons. All right, so now you have high energy electrons. Great. That's the good news. What's the bad? They're unstable. They're really hard to control. Okay. High energy electrons by themselves, actually, they damage DNA, and they're like, you know, they're okay. They're hard to control. So how do you control electrons? You stabilize them by binding them to carbon. Okay. So you then take these high energy electrons and you bond them to carbon. Well, you and I don't, plants do. Okay. So hold it. The carbon dioxide is gaining the electrons. So what am I going to label that arrow right there? What is that?
Reduction.
Reduction. And I didn't do this step right here. My apologies. That was step 4. Red pen. Step 4. Bang. So then the process of the high energy electrons being bonded to the carbon dioxide gives us this. This would then be that's step 5. Put that right there. Now, depending on the age of your professors, depends on what term they will use. Okay, the old school term is called carbon fixation. If your professor uses that, that's old school. Okay, the most common term now is the more modern term is carboxylation. Okay, because then when you get into cell resp and these electrons are pulled back out, that's decarboxylation. Very cool. Now, occasionally you will hear people refer to this as the Calvin cycle. which we will hit in about 3 weeks. Okay, and this is simply the bonding of the high energy electrons to the carbon dioxide, ultimately to make glucose macromolecules. Okay. However, this equation is unbalanced. You've got 6 carbons here, but only 1 carbon there. So do you remember the stoichiometry? How many moles of carbon dioxide, how many moles of water to produce how many moles of glucose to release how many moles of oxygen? Do you remember the numbers?
Numbers, not exactly.
Wasn't it 6? Six?
Let he who hath understanding reckon the number of the beast, for it is a human number. Any of you guys Iron Maiden fans?
Somewhat.
Somewhat? You guys know about Number of the Beast with Iron Maiden?
Yes.
Came out when I was in high school. It was amazing. I was a freshman in high school when that album came out. Ooh, it was awesome. Super, super cool. Okay. All right. So I think that's a really good place to stop. We will get into the steps and add more color when we come back to this next week. Okay. So over the weekend, when you get into your data analysis and you get into your graphs, you're going to have questions. They're coming. Okay. So we will try to coordinate some time, and I can get together with you. And usually it's really hard to explain. Okay, if you click here and then if you click there on a text, that's a big ask. So usually it's easier. You and I will jump on Google Meet, and probably about 5 to 7 minutes we can get you rolling. Okay. And the color coordinating is important, and you want to pick nice, dynamically different and bold colors. Okay. Stay away from pastels, right? Don't make it Easter and go, oh, a pale blue, get like a dark blue and a dark red, and get it really vibrant. Have those colors jump off the page, especially because the graders see it electronically. They don't see your IA on paper anymore. It's all electronic. So let's have it stream off the screen at them. Screaming off the screen. That's kind of fun. That was fun to say. Awesome. So if you guys could type attend over in the chat, and we will train up the juniors for you on Saturday, and maybe Miss Maines, hopefully Miss Maines. And then we did not, I decided not to crash Anderson's class on Tuesday morning. The more I thought about that, because that's the way we've always done it, and I thought, hold it, I'm just doing what we've always done. We're virtual now. So you'll still have a regular 0 period with Maines on Tuesday. That's why I posted the groupings, and be sure that you add your cell phone number and your email so the juniors can get a hold of you. All right. I will talk to you guys over the next couple of days, and I will let you know how we're going to get Maines tuned up to provide you with feedback. Cool?
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Have a great weekend. Bye, everyone.
Awesome.
You too. Bye.
Good for day weekend.
Mr. Manor.
Thank you.